the donors or to the NGOs. So what we really need, because when we look at the problems associated with gathering this information so we can build a science and build curricula to teach you, for you to learn, when we look at the literature, number one, there's no structure. If there's no structure to the reports, then how do we compare stuff? So when I did the book on the earthquake and tsunami in 5 countries, and we looked at that, there was no common structure. It took over 1,000 references, and what I thought was going to be a 4-month project turned out to be 4 years. Because we couldn't get any organization of the information. Furthermore, there's no consistent use of terminology. The terms are all over the map. We can't even find a common definition of a disaster. There's so many floating around, and that creates some issues for us, obviously. Furthermore, the information is everywhere. It's in the gray literature, namely the literature in UN documents, etc. It's in journals that have published only one article relative to the earthquake and tsunami. It's published in the journal that I've been privileged to work with for several years. And furthermore, in the setting of crises, it's impossible basically to do a randomized controlled study. How do we do that? So that immediately impacts our ability to get the information and data that we need and to develop the evidence. And so therefore, what we're doing, it's difficult to prove cause and effect. What caused what and why, and what happened, and we don't know that. So isn't this exciting? We know so much. This is a great field to get into, people. It's a great field to get into because it's wide open for study. And we know that disasters are, we can predict. We know you're going to have another earthquake in Indonesia, right? We know that. When? You don't know. No two disasters are exactly the same, which means in terms of the science that we're used to, it becomes impossible to apply scientific methodology of randomized controlled studies. There are geographic differences and cultural differences. It's hard to get money to get ready. It's much easier to get money after it happened. There was more money donated following the earthquake and tsunami of 2004. There was more money donated than ever before for any disaster. And so there was plenty of money. That wasn't an issue. It took a long time to get here, however. And then research and evaluation is a low priority when people are really screaming and hurting. So it's hard to get that information. So we don't have uniformly accepted definitions. We don't have a framework to provide the structure. And we have a lack of endorsed indicators for specific aspects of the disaster. Furthermore, if we're talking about evidence, and you all ought to look at what constitutes evidence, are we talking about doing things that are evidence-based? I said it's hard to get the evidence. And so often we have to go to, rather than accumulating good scientific evidence, we get evidence that is informed by some studies. But we can't say in terms of cause and effect. Or do we look at the evidence-based versus the best available information we can get? And what we really do now is we have evidence based on eminence. The fact that I've been to X number of disasters, I now become an expert. And if I become an expert, then you better listen to me like you're doing, right? And so we run into trouble in terms of the study of disasters because most of the information is eminence-based. Let me give you an example of some of the problems with a couple of examples. With relief supplies. This is a photograph taken in Bosnia by one of the people who's worked very hard with us in terms of putting this material together. These are neckties from the United States that were sent to Bosnia as relief. Who in Bosnia wears a necktie? And so what good was it? This stuff not only came in huge quantities, but it took up warehousing, collection, it took up warehouse space. You had to transport it to the airplane, you had to load it on the airplane, you had to fly it over to Bosnia, you had to unload the airplane, you had to put it in a warehouse, you had to open it, look at it, and then you had to distribute it. So this stuff got in the way, basically. And it really was. So when we looked at drugs, for example, the group that reported in the New England Journal of Medicine. 50% of the 34 tons of donations were inappropriate. They had no use to the affected community. The drugs were unsorted, and they required people to sit down and resort, repackage, because they weren't even labeled in the language of the recipient population. And about a quarter of it was useless or unusable. The inappropriate donations were worth about $25 million, and it cost the Bosnian government $34 million to get rid of it. Whoa. What could each of us do with $34 million, US dollars? Huh? Wouldn't that be nice? Hurricane Andrew, which was in Florida, created another problem. Here's people sorting through the material that was sent to South Florida. The material was 17 feet high and covered 5 acres of land, all piled up. This all had to be moved to landfills, and they included things like paint and paint thinner and other hazardous materials had to be buried. But that's the stuff that is sent, because people are dumping, and the word that's frequently used is drug dumping. The pharmaceutical industry sends drugs that are outdated or have no relevance to the practice, say in the United States, and they send all this stuff over, and then they take a tax deduction for it. So it's helpful for them because they donated it. Oh my. So one of the things we need to know, we got to prevent as many disasters as possible. Preventing disasters, not the events. We got to prevent as many events as we can, but we'll look at the difference between those in a moment. We have to decrease the impact of future events, and we have to develop evidence so that we can develop standards and best practices so we know what the hell to teach you guys, what we should teach you guys. So this is the first of the guidelines that was published. It was published in 2003, from which much of the stuff comes today, but we essentially moved 10 years from there, and we now have a very different science than it was then. So what we need to do is be able to compare events. We need to be able to compare the damages from the events. We need to figure out what the damages did to the ability of the hospital to function, for example. We should be able to compare societies or compare hospitals and look at the interventions and develop evidence so that we can essentially develop the curricula that you need. So that's just by way of introduction of some of the problems. I hope you can see that if this interests you at all, there's a huge field here for work. And it's a good field. It's difficult, and the people that do this are very special people, in my opinion. They're people that don't have other parts of the profession, that everybody is equal and everybody works together as a team. That's really important. And how do you get there, and basically how can you be educated and trained to do this? The next step, it's a little too early to take a break, isn't it? Okay, just wanted to check with you. The next step is to look at a conceptual framework on how can we look at some of this stuff in a structure and get the right definitions. And so there's really some important issues here. We do not expect, either Elaine or myself, we do not expect for you to be able to write an exam when we're done at noon. We could do it if you want. And do you want to take an exam? I'm kidding, obviously. But we want to broaden your perspective. And what we want to do here is make sure that we all are using the same definitions. And this progression from a hazard to a disaster is a framework. And we're going to take these pieces apart for you and let you look at them so you can make sure that you have some idea of the whole picture. The first thing is a hazard. And we know that you have many hazards here in Indonesia. One of them is you have a confluence of 3 fault lines, right? Laksana, is that right? 3 fault lines, I think. And that puts you in a very difficult place in terms of a hazard. So what do we mean by a hazard? A hazard is a dangerous phenomena, substance, or human activity or condition that may cause a loss of life, injury, or other impacts, property damage, loss of livelihood,